The first zero appears at 11,000 feet. 47 more follow in tight formation, their engines a distant hum that hasn't reached the airfield yet. Below them, Henderson Field sits exposed under the midday sun. 20,000 Marines scattered across foxholes, airstrips, fuel dumps, and makeshift hospitals. Not one of them knows what's coming. The Japanese bombers adjust their angle. Bomb bay doors open. 60 seconds until impact, and no one on the ground had even looked up yet. But this moment didn't come out of nowhere. 3 hours earlier, 150 miles to the northwest, a man sat hunched over a radio transmitter in a jungle so thick sunlight barely reached the ground. His name was Paul Mason. He was 34 years old, Australian. A plantation manager before the war turned him into something the military didn't have a name for yet. Coastwatcher. The term sounds almost peaceful. It wasn't. Mason had every reason to be somewhere else. When the Japanese swept through the Solomon Islands in early 1942, most Europeans evacuated. Civilians, administrators, businessmen, they got on boats and left. Mason stayed. Not because he was brave, because he'd spent 12 years learning the land, the people, the patterns of weather and ocean current, and leaving felt like surrender. He wasn't a soldier, never trained for combat. His expertise was copra production and managing plantation workers. But the Australian military needed eyes in the occupied islands, and Mason knew the terrain better than any man they could parachute in. So they gave him a radio, a teleradio 3BZ. 40 pounds of vacuum tubes and battery packs that required constant maintenance in humidity that rotted metal within weeks. The instruction manual was 60 pages. Mason had 3 days to learn it before the Navy dropped him back into Japanese-occupied territory. He was terrified, not of dying, though that was constant, but of making a mistake that would get other men killed. By August 8, 1942, Guadalcanal had become the hinge on which the Pacific War would swing. The Americans had landed there weeks earlier in their first major offensive against Japan. 20,000 Marines, many of them teenagers, dug into defensive positions around Henderson Field, a half-finished airstrip they'd captured from the Japanese. That airstrip was everything. With it, the Allies could project air power across the Solomon Islands. Without it, the Japanese would retain control of the entire South Pacific supply route. Both sides knew this. Both sides were bleeding for it. The Japanese Navy controlled the waters around Guadalcanal at night, running supply missions the Marines called the Tokyo Express. American aircraft controlled the daylight hours, but only if they had warning before Japanese air raids arrived. No warning meant planes destroyed on the ground, fuel depots obliterated, Marines caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Henderson Field had no radar, no early warning system, no way to see what was coming until it was too late, except for men like Paul Mason, hidden in the jungle with a radio. Mason wasn't alone in the mountains. Scattered across the Solomon Islands were roughly 22 coastwatchers, Australians, New Zealanders, a few British colonials who'd refused to evacuate. They lived in native villages or built camps in the jungle interior, always moving, always hiding. The Japanese knew they existed and hunted them constantly. The life expectancy was measured in weeks. Each coastwatcher had a radio, a codebook, and a network of indigenous Solomon Islanders who served as scouts, porters, and protectors. Without these local allies, the coastwatchers would have been captured within days. The scouts would climb to high points, watch the skies and seas, then run for hours through jungle paths to report what they'd seen. The system was fragile. Batteries died. Tropical storms knocked out transmissions. Japanese direction-finding equipment could locate a radio within minutes. Every transmission was a calculated risk, long enough to get the message through, short enough to avoid being traced. And the messages had to be fast. Japanese planes flew at 180 miles per hour. From the moment a coastwatcher spotted them until they reached Henderson Field might be 90 minutes, might be 40, might be less. On August 8, 1942, Paul Mason woke up to the sound of aircraft engines. The jungle at dawn is never quiet. Birds start before first light. Cockatoos, honey-eaters, the harsh scrape of crowned pigeons. Insects add their frequencies. The canopy drips with moisture from the night, and when the sun finally breaks through, steam rises from the vegetation like the earth itself is breathing. Mason had been awake since 0400. His sleep schedule no longer followed human rhythms. He dozed when he could, woke at any sound that didn't belong. His camp was 8 miles inland, positioned on a ridge that gave line of sight to the coast. Not a permanent structure, just a tarp strung between trees, the radio equipment wrapped in oilcloth, supplies cached in locations only he and his scouts knew. His native scouts had spotted Japanese activity the day before. Ships moving. That meant resupply. That meant something was coming. At 8:58 hours, one of the scouts came running up the trail. Not walking, running. Mason knew before the man spoke. You didn't run unless it was urgent. The scout's name was Silas, a young man from a coastal village who'd been educated by missionaries and spoke 3 languages. He was breathing hard, pointing northwest toward Bougainville. Big planes, many, coming this way. Mason grabbed his binoculars and moved to the observation point, a break in the canopy where you could see a section of sky and the distant haze where ocean met the horizon. He glassed the area Silas indicated. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then he saw them. Aircraft identification is an art form Coastwatchers learned for necessity. You couldn't just report planes. Command needed numbers, types, altitude, heading. The difference between bombers and fighters determined how Henderson Field would respond. Get it wrong, and fighters would scramble for a raid that never came, wasting precious fuel. Or, worse, they'd stay grounded when bombers arrived. Mason steadied the binoculars. The glare was hard. The planes were distant, sunlight reflecting from metal. He started counting. Bombers first. Twin-engined Mitsubishi G4Ms. The Allies called them Bettys. He counted 18. Then he saw more. 24. No, 27. They were in tight formation, 3 groups of 9. Above them, fighters, zeros. Harder to count because they moved more, weaving to maintain speed over the slower bombers. He estimated 15, maybe 20, and they were headed southeast, directly toward Guadalcanal. Mason checked his watch. 08:52 hours. Distance to Henderson Field, roughly 150 miles. Flight time at cruising speed, roughly 50 minutes. He had to transmit, now. If he hesitated even half a minute, Henderson Field wouldn't be alerted. It would be a funeral pyre. Getting the radio operational took 3 minutes. Unwrap the equipment, connect the battery, string the antenna wire between trees at the correct height. Too low and the signal wouldn't carry, too high and it acted like a beacon for Japanese direction finders. Check the frequency. The crystals in the radio had to be swapped manually to change channels. Mason's hands moved fast but steady. This was the moment he was most vulnerable. Once he started transmitting, any Japanese monitoring equipment within 30 miles could pick up the signal. They had trucks with direction-finding gear, teams that would triangulate his position within minutes. He adjusted the headset, tapped out his call sign in Morse code. Ken to PWD, priority message. Ken was his identifier. PWD was the Allied monitoring station at Port Moresby, over 600 miles away. The message had to go there first, then they'd relay it to Guadalcanal. The system added minutes to the warning time, but there was no direct link. Mason's hand moved across the telegraph key. 27 bombers, 20 fighters, course 130, Angels 10, headed yours. He sent it twice, standard procedure. Then he shut down, disconnected everything, and moved. The entire transmission lasted 90 seconds. 90 seconds that could cost him his life or save 20,000 others. At Port Moresby, a radio operator named Davies copied the message at 0859 hours. Davies was 22. He'd been in the Pacific for 8 months and had learned that messages from Coastwatchers meant two things. Someone's life was in danger and time was critical. He didn't wait for authorization or confirmation. He grabbed the message slip and ran it to the duty officer. The duty officer read it once, then grabbed the phone connected to the direct line to Guadalcanal. This was where the system almost failed. The phone line was a submarine cable that had been patched together by Navy technicians using spare parts and prayer. It worked about 70% of the time. When it didn't, they had to use standard radio transmission, which added another 5 minutes. The duty officer lifted the receiver. Dead silence. He tried again. Nothing. The line was out. He looked at Davies. Radio transmission. Flash priority. Move. Davies ran back to the radio room, switched frequencies, sent the warning to Guadalcanal using standard radio protocol, which meant spelling out the message in code, which meant it took longer. 4 minutes had passed since Mason's transmission. At 0903 hours, the operations tent at Henderson Field received the warning. The message came through crackling with static, but the radio operator got it down. Inbound raid, 27 bombers, 20 fighters, course 130, Angels 10, headed yours. Major Joseph Renner, the operations officer, grabbed the message and did the math in his head. If the Coastwatcher spotted them at roughly 0850 and they were 150 miles out, and the relay took this long, they'd arrive around 0945, maybe sooner if they increased speed. He had 40 minutes, maybe less. If Mason's count was off even by a handful of seconds, the bombers would arrive before the Wildcats ever left the ground. Renner hit the alarm. Across Henderson Field, sirens began wailing. It was a sound the Marines had heard too many times in the past weeks, that rising, falling pitch that meant drop everything and run. Pilots sprinted toward their aircraft, F4F Wildcats, stubby fighters that looked ungainly on the ground but could hold their own against Zeros if they had altitude advantage. Getting altitude took time. They needed to be in the air now. Ground crews yanked wheel chocks, engines coughed, caught, roared to life. The Wildcats didn't have electric starters. Each one required a crew member to hand crank the inertia starter, a brutal process in the tropical heat. Planes began rolling. 18 Wildcats were operational that morning. 18. That was it. The rest were damaged, out of fuel, or cannibalized for parts. The United States was fighting a war across 2 oceans with equipment that kept breaking and supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Each Wildcat carried 4.5 caliber machine guns and about 30 seconds of ammunition. Once you started firing, you ran out fast, which meant every burst had to count. The pilots were exhausted. They'd been flying multiple sorties daily, sleeping in tents that flooded when it rained, eating food supplemented with captured Japanese rice because American supplies weren't getting through consistently. Captain Marion Carl led the flight. He was 25 years old, already an ace. He'd shot down 9 Japanese aircraft, which made him one of the most experienced combat pilots on Guadalcanal. As his Wildcat lifted off the metal matting that served as a runway, he checked his watch. 0912. They had maybe 35 minutes to gain altitude, position themselves, and intercept the incoming raid before it reached the field. If the Coastwatchers' report was accurate, if the Japanese hadn't changed course, if the math was right. Fighter tactics in 1942 were still being written. The lessons that would become doctrine, energy fighting, boom and zoom, altitude advantage, were being learned by men who survived and forgotten by men who didn't. Carl knew that altitude was life. The side that attacked from above controlled the engagement. The Wildcats climbed in formation, engines straining, gaining maybe 1,500 feet per minute. The Japanese bombers would be at around 10,000 feet. The Zeros would be higher, maybe 12,000 or 15,000. Carl pushed his flight to 18,000 feet. At that altitude, the air was thinner, the engine less responsive. The men weren't wearing oxygen masks. They didn't have enough to go around. Some pilots got lightheaded, kept flying anyway. Below them, Henderson Field had transformed. Every vehicle moved into revetments. Fuel trucks dispersed. Marines scrambled into foxholes and slit trenches that had been dug precisely for this. The wounded in the field hospital were being moved into dugouts covered with palm logs and sandbags. It wouldn't stop a direct hit, but it might save them from shrapnel. 20,000 men waited. None of them could change what was coming. Only the men in the sky could. The Marines on the ground couldn't fight what was coming. They could only hide and hope the Wildcats got there first. At 0928, Carl spotted them. If the Coastwatcher had been wrong by even a mile, they would have missed this moment entirely. They were right where the Coastwatcher said they'd be, coming in from the northwest, formations tight, bombers in their neat groups of 9, with zeros weaving above them in a protective screen. 27 bombers, he counted. The report had been exact. Carl's voice came over the radio, calm despite what was about to happen. Tally-ho, bandits at 11 o'clock level. The Wildcats dove. No turning back now. The first pass would decide whether Henderson Field lived or died. Not straight down, that would give away too much speed and make it impossible to pull out. A controlled dive, building velocity, positioning for a high-side attack that would let them slash through the Japanese formation, fire, and climb back out before the Zeros could react. This was the moment that decided everything. If the Coastwatcher's warning had arrived 5 minutes later, the Wildcats would still be climbing when the bombers reached Henderson Field. The raid would hit unopposed. Bombs would crater the runway, destroy aircraft on the ground, kill men huddled in foxholes who had no defense against high explosive dropped from 10,000 feet. But the warning came when it did, and the Wildcats were in position. The first pass scattered the bomber formation. Carl came in fast, fired a burst into the lead bomber, saw pieces fly off the wing. The bomber staggered but held formation. The Japanese trained their pilots to maintain discipline even under fire. It made them dangerous. The other Wildcats followed, each picking targets, firing short bursts, breaking away before the Zeros could dive on them. The sky filled with tracer rounds, bright lines of phosphorus that looked almost beautiful if you forgot they were designed to kill. One bomber began trailing smoke. Another dropped out of formation, losing altitude, one engine dead. But the bombers kept coming. They'd been given a mission: destroy Henderson Field. They would complete it or die trying. That was the code they flew under. The Zeros reacted now, diving to engage the Wildcats. Zero versus Wildcat was a mismatch in some ways. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, climbed better. But the Wildcat could take damage and keep flying. And American pilots had learned not to dogfight, to use speed and power to strike and disengage. Carl pulled hard, felt the G-forces press him into his seat, vision tunneling. A Zero flashed past, guns sparking. Missed. He rolled, dove, came up behind another bomber. Fired. The bomber's port engine exploded. The aircraft heeled over, began a slow spiral toward the ocean 10,000 feet below. But the rest were approaching their drop point. At 0941, the lead bomber group opened their bomb bay doors. On the ground, Marines saw the black shapes against the sky. They pressed themselves into the dirt. Some prayed, some just waited. The bombardier in the lead Betty had Henderson Field centered in his sights. The runway was clear, perfect target. He reached for the release. Then another Wildcat came in. Lieutenant Roger Haberman, 23 years old, from Iowa, flying with his fuel gauge showing near empty and his ammunition counter reading 30 rounds left. He should have broken off, should have saved himself, should have headed back to base. He didn't. He closed to less than 100 yards, suicidally close, and fired everything he had left into the bomber's cockpit. The Betty nosed up violently, the pilot dead or dying. It collided with the bomber flying off its wing. Both aircraft disintegrated. The formation broke. This was the margin the Marines needed and the Japanese hadn't planned for. Bomber pilots watching two of their own vanish in a ball of fire scattered. Some dropped early, some turned away. The tight, coordinated strike that was supposed to blanket Henderson Field with high explosive became a chaotic mess of individual aircraft trying to survive. Bombs fell. They hit jungle. They hit the beach. They hit empty revetments. But they missed the runway, missed the fuel dumps, missed the massed formations of men. 7 Japanese bombers went down. 3 Wildcats didn't come back. One of them was Haberman. He'd saved the field but didn't have enough fuel to make it home. He ditched in the ocean 2 miles offshore. Rescue crews found his body 3 days later. By 1000 hours, it was over. Henderson Field was still operational. Damaged but operational. The Marines crawled out of their holes, checked each other, counted the cost. 11 dead from bomb splinters and near misses. Could have been hundreds, could have been thousands. Would have been without the warning. Paul Mason never saw what his transmission accomplished. He was 8 miles inland, radio packed, camp already moved to a new position. He'd heard the explosions, distant thunder rolling across the jungle. He didn't know if his message got through, didn't know if it arrived in time. The next day, he received a brief confirmation via radio. Message received. Good work. That was all. No details, no explanation of what had happened. In the world of Coastwatchers, you sent intelligence and trusted someone else would use it. You didn't get to see the results. Mason would continue broadcasting for another 2 years, always moving, always hunted. He'd report hundreds of Japanese aircraft, dozens of ship movements, provide targeting data that guided Allied operations across the Solomon Islands. After the war, he'd return to his plantation, try to resume normal life, and find that normal didn't exist anymore. The Solomon Islanders who served as his scouts received little recognition. Many of them died protecting coastwatchers from Japanese patrols. Their names were never widely known. Their sacrifices footnoted in histories that focused on the big battles, the famous generals, the decisive moments that looked dramatic on maps. But those scouts were part of the network. Without them, there was no early warning. Without early warning, Henderson Field would have fallen. And if Henderson Field had fallen, Guadalcanal would have been lost. If Guadalcanal was lost, the Japanese would have controlled the South Pacific for months, maybe years longer. The war would have ground on, swallowed more lives, pushed victory further into an uncertain future. Military historians still debate exactly how many lives that single transmission saved. 20,000 Marines were on Guadalcanal when Mason's warning arrived. If the Japanese raid had hit with no warning, planes destroyed on the ground, fuel dumps burning, command structure shattered, the Japanese ground forces would have launched their planned assault within hours. The Marines would have been defending without air support, without resupply, against an enemy that controlled the sea at night. Some estimates say half the American force would have been lost. 10,000 casualties. Others argue the entire position would have been overrun within a week, 20,000. The truth is somewhere in between, but the transmission that took 90 seconds to send changed the trajectory of the battle. It gave the Wildcats time to intercept. That interception broke the raid. That broken raid meant Henderson Field survived another day, and then another, and another. The Coastwatcher network continued throughout the Pacific War. By 1943, the system had expanded to include observation posts throughout the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines. The reporting became more sophisticated, standardized codes, better equipment, dedicated relay stations that reduced transmission time. But the basic principle remained. One person, in the right place, with the courage to transmit, could change everything. The Allies won the Pacific War through industrial production, strategic bombing, island-hopping campaigns, and eventual nuclear weapons. But underneath those massive forces were hundreds of small moments, messages sent, intelligence gathered, warnings delivered with minutes to spare. Paul Mason's transmission on August 8, 1942, was one of those moments. It arrived not hours early, not with comfortable margin. It arrived with barely enough time for the fighters to scramble, climb to altitude, and intercept. It arrived when it needed to, because Mason recognized what he was seeing, counted correctly, transmitted immediately, and trusted the system would work. 1 minute later, and the Wildcats would still be climbing. 5 minutes later, and the bombs would already be falling. Henderson Field remained operational for the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese launched dozens more air raids. The Tokyo Express kept running at night, landing troops, supplies, artillery. The fighting continued for another 4 months, brutal, exhausting, a grinding attrition that consumed men on both sides. But the Americans held, and holding Guadalcanal meant the road to Tokyo stayed open. When the Japanese finally evacuated in February 1943, they left behind thousands of dead, abandoned equipment, and the first major defeat of the Pacific War. The myth of Japanese invincibility died in those jungles. And it died partly because a plantation manager turned coastwatcher sat in the jungle with a 40-pound radio and sent a message that arrived exactly when it needed to. History remembers the pilots who flew, the generals who planned, the Marines who fought. It should also remember the man who counted aircraft and pressed a telegraph key for 90 seconds. But another coastwatcher, hidden on a different island, would intercept a message that revealed something even more dangerous. A Japanese plan already in motion that could reverse everything the Allies had won.